6. Gathering of the Grannies. Breakfast was cream cheese. Lunch was cream cheese. Tea was more cream cheese. After just one day, Joe was the colour of cream cheese. The house had never felt so big, and he had never felt so small. His parents were away in another country. Mrs. Jinks and Mr. Lampy were dead. There was just Joe and Granny, and he knew with a horrible sick feeling in the pit of his stomach that he was completely in her power. Of course, Granny was enjoying every minute of it, moving round the house, warbling to herself like a sick canary as she glued shut the windows and turned up the heating. By lunchtime, Joe was sweating. "You look ill, dear," Granny trilled. "I'm hot." "It must be the flu. You'd better have 2 spoonfuls of cod liver oil. Better still, I'll go to the fishmonger's and buy you a whole cod's liver." That afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Warden telephoned from the south of France. Although Joe was in the room, they didn't ask to speak to him. Instead, Mrs. Warden gabbled down the phone to Granny at twice her usual speed. She always did this to save money on long-distance calls. "Are you sure everything's all right, Mumsy?" she asked. "Don't you worry, dear. Jasper and I are having a wonderful time. He's no trouble at all." "There is one thing, Mummy. Could you put an advert in The Lady for a new nanny? We'll have to have one when we get back." "Oh, Jack won't be needing a new nanny." Joe heard the words. They sent a shiver down his spine. "Mummy?" Granny was holding the telephone in a claw-like hand. She smiled into it. "Lovely talking to you, dear. Must go." The smile evaporated. Granny hung up. Granny made a number of telephone calls after that, but Joe was pretty certain that none of them were to the lady. She was careful to close the door before she began, but Joe did manage to hear her checking train times with British Rail, and so assumed that she, and presumably he with her, was about to go away. This was confirmed at the end of the day. Joe had eaten his supper on his own and was settling down to watch television when the door opened and Granny came in. "Bedtime, Jane, dear." "I'm Joe, and it's only 8 o'clock. I never go to bed before 9. "Don't argue with Granny. Granny knows best." "But I'm watching the bill." "So am I, dear." Granny flicked the television off. "The electricity bill, and that should save a bit. Now, up to bed." But the torment didn't even stop there. Although it was a warm night, Granny had insisted on his wearing a vest as well as his pyjamas, a dressing gown as well as a vest, and 2 extra blankets on top of everything else. "We don't want your flu to get any worse, do we, dear?" she said when she came into his room. "I can't sleep like this," Joe said. "I feel like a sausage roll." "You can't have a sausage roll now, dear," Granny replied, "but maybe I'll get you one for tomorrow." And with a soft giggle, she switched off the light and went out. Joe lay in bed for a long time. He was too hot to sleep and also too angry. As he lay in the half-darkness, he began to think about how unfair life was. He was 12, almost 13, years old. He could read, write, add up, speak French, swim, juggle, and name over 1,000 characters in science fiction books and films. But did he have any life of his own? No. His every movement was controlled and organised by adults with less imagination than him. His parents, the teacher at his posh prep school, they were all the same, passing him around as if he were no more than a tin of sweets. Of course, it wouldn't be so bad if the grown-ups had more sense. But nobody had to be qualified to be a parent. And his parents were not only unqualified, they had quite happily handed him to a woman who hated him and who in the last few weeks had just killed his 2 best friends. But who would believe him? Nobody. If he hadn't been so hot and angry, maybe he would have slept. But he was still awake at 9 o'clock when the doorbell rang. He was awake at 9:10 when it rang again, and he had given up any idea of sleeping by past when it rang for a 3rd time. As the evening dragged on, Joe began to hear strange sounds coming from downstairs. The hiss of a can being opened and a peal of high-pitched laughter, a clink of glasses and the slam of a cupboard door. More laughter. There seemed to be 4 or 5 women downstairs. The muffled sound of arguing and then another cackle of laughter drifted up into his room. In the end he couldn't bear it any longer. He got up and went downstairs. The hall was dark, but the door to the living room was half open, which was how the sounds had escaped. Thankful for his bare feet and the thick carpets, Joe tiptoed forward and peeped in. An extraordinary sight met his eyes. There were 5 grannies in the room, playing poker. They had assembled a green baize card table and had 2 decks of cards scattered over the surface, on the floor and, in at least 2 instances, up their sleeves. The room was thick with smoke. 2 of the grannies were smoking cigarettes, while a third had helped herself to one of Mr. Warden's cigars. They had opened 6 cans of beer and a bottle of whisky. There were glasses everywhere. Granny had also provided food. There was a bowl of popcorn, some bright pink hot dogs with fried onions and American mustard, a plate of pickled cucumbers, 2 boxes of Fortnum & Mason chocolates, some salt beef sandwiches and several packets of chewing gum. Joe wasn't at all surprised there wasn't an ounce of cream cheese in sight. But what made the spectacle so bizarre as well as so revolting was the old ladies themselves. Their combined ages must have added up to well over 400. Joe had once seen a few minutes of a video called Revenge of the Killer Zombies. It had given him nightmares for a week. Well, this was far, far worse. Granny 1 was a small, shriveled woman, no more than 4 feet high. Her head barely came over the edge of the table and she was blinking at the cards in her hand with small pink eyes. She seemed to be finding it difficult to balance on her chair, perhaps because of the enormous amount of jewellery she was wearing and the bulging handbag she was clutching to her chest. This Granny's hands were everywhere at once, holding her cards and trying to stop her neighbour seeing them, guarding her bag, tilting her whisky glass towards her lips and poking her nose and ears. Look quickly and you might think she had 4 arms. Her name was Granny Ann. Granny 2 was wearing what looked like a pair of curtains, but they were curtains you would draw at your peril, for this Granny was immensely fat. She was so fat that she seemed to have partially melted into her chair. She was obviously a careful poker player, as she was keeping her cards close to her chin, or rather chins, for she had 3 of them. The third of these was crowned with a wispy beard. Granny 2 was sucking a hot dog. She couldn't eat it as, for extra comfort, she had removed her false teeth and placed them in front of her on the table. Her name was Granny Smith. The first things Joe noticed about Granny 3 were her quite horrible eyes. She was wearing a heavy pair of spectacles which, over the years, had stretched her ears and sunk into her nose. In fact, her entire face was lopsided and she hadn't helped it by putting on too much lipstick, at the same time missing her lips. Her eyeballs, magnified by what looked like inch-thick glasses, were a milky shade of white, with one a little higher than the other. Granny 3 was smoking, eating, drinking and talking all at the same time, and all the time she was watching. Her eyes darting about in her drooping sockets missed nothing. She answered to the name of Granny Adams. Granny 4, shoveling enormous handfuls of popcorn into her mouth, was a vulture. She had the same long neck, bald head and cruel eyes, and she was wearing a flowing green cloak mounted with feathers which added to the illusion. This was the Granny who was smoking the cigar. She was using it to point with, and as Joe watched, the glowing tip caught Granny Smith on the chin. Granny Smith cried out and fell backwards, 2 aces tumbling out of her jacket. Granny Adams threw a glass of beer at her and screamed with laughter while Granny Ann pounded the table and chewed gum. This last Granny was called Granny Lee. Dominating the table was Granny herself, looking almost royal in a billowing dress with flouncy neck and sleeves. She was sitting with her arms and legs apart and a scowl on her face. Suddenly she threw her cards down. "A full house, king's high, beat that," she announced. "I've got a pair of 2s, Granny Ann exclaimed in a quivering voice. Granny Smith grabbed them and tore them up. "You lose, Anne. 2 2s aren't worth anything." Well, I've got another 2 in my bra, Anne exclaimed. Cheat, 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 Granny Adams screeched with laughter. I haven't got anything, she added, and threw her cards in a shower over her head. Well, I've got a royal flush, the vulture granny snapped. Ace, king, queen, knave, 10. She spread the cards on the table. How did you do that? Granny scrabbled at the cards, examining them as if they were forgeries. Her face had gone dark red. You've been cheating as well, haven't you, Lee? Of course I've been cheating, Granny Lee replied. We've all been cheating, but I've just been cheating better than you. Well, how much do I owe you? Granny was sulking now, her lip jutting out and her shoulders slumped. Let me see. Granny Lee scribbled a few figures on a sheet of paper. That's 2 shillings and 4pence. How much is that in new money? Granny Ann asked nervously. We don't have nasty new money here, Anne, Granny replied. She brought her elbow up sharply, catching the little Granny in the eye. 2 shillings and 4pence is just what it says it is. Oh, lovely old money, Granny Smith sighed, her 3 chins rising and falling in perfect unison. It used to be worth something once, money did. I could buy dinner for 3 people with 2 shillings and 4pence. Yes, Granny Lee snapped, but the trouble was you'd eat it all yourself. And her whole body shook as she laughed uncontrollably. Meanwhile, Granny had gathered in the torn and crumpled cards and was once again shuffling the pack. So tell me, Ivy, Granny Ann asked, what's the news about that grandson of yours? At the door, Jo froze. Yes, Granny Adams rubbed her hands together. Her eyes rolled like 2 worms in walnut shells. How are his enzymes? Enzymes, enzymes, Granny Lee and Granny Ann chorused. Granny held up a hand. You'll find out soon enough, she rasped. I'm taking him with me tomorrow. What? The other grannies stared in amazement and delight. Can you? Granny Smith asked. What about his parents? They're not here, Granny replied. Anyway, they don't care a jot about him. They won't even notice. Do you mean? Granny Lee twisted her neck until the bones clicked. You've got him all to yourself? Granny nodded. Yes, I've had quite a bit of fun at his expense, I can tell you. She licked her lips and began to deal. But maybe I'm getting old. I feel I haven't quite made him miserable enough. Jo felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. If only he could have tape-recorded this conversation. His parents would have had to believe him. He'd guessed that Granny hated him. Now he had the proof of it. But all that talk of enzymes worried him. What were they planning? Where was he going to be taken? How I hate children, the vulture Granny moaned. Me too. I can't stand them. I detest them. All the grannies were nodding so vigorously that Jo wouldn't have been surprised if their heads had come loose from their necks and rolled across the surface of the card table. You know what I hate about them? Granny Smith said. I hate their perfect skin. It's all pink and shiny and smooth. I hate their hair, so thick and wavy. But most of all, I hate their teeth. She gazed at her own down on the table in front of her. Do you know where children keep their teeth? In their mouths. It isn't fair. I hate children because they're so healthy, Granny Ann went on. They're always shouting and playing and having fun and running about. I haven't run about anywhere since 1958, and that was only for a bus. I hate them because of everything they've got, Granny Adams muttered. We never had computers and pop music and T-shirts and mountain bikes, but they have. I fought in 2 world wars, but nobody ever gave me a skateboard. Oh, no. Children smell, Granny Lee announced. They're too small and they make too much noise. Why can't they be more like us? Yes, with arthritis and swollen knees, hard of hearing. What? And wrinkly. Horrid, 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 horrid. All 5 grannies were chorusing together now and pounding their fists on the table at the same time. Joe couldn't believe what he was seeing. It seemed that the 5 old ladies had gone quite mad. At last Granny stopped them. "But we can at least get our revenge," she said. "There are so many ways to upset a grandchild." "Oh, yes," Granny Adams giggled. Her glasses jumped up and down on her nose. "When I see my grandchildren, I always poke them a lot. I do find that children hate being poked." "I don't just poke them," the little granny said. "I pat them on their heads and fiddle with their clothes. It does annoy them so, although of course they're not allowed to complain." "And don't forget the kiss," Granny Smith said. "The wet kiss on the cheek makes them squirm like frogs in a pond." "What about presents?" Granny asked. "Presents are a marvellous way of spoiling any child's day." "Oh yes, a boring book token. Talcum powder. Something you know they've already got." "What I do," Granny said, "is buy them something that's too young for them, something that will make them feel babyish. They feel so ashamed, it's hilarious." At the door, Joe remembered the toy robot and found that his face was burning once again. But this time it wasn't with embarrassment, it was anger. "I have a much better idea," Granny Lee said. "I buy my grandchildren hideously unsuitable clothes. I've managed to find some of the most ghastly pullovers in the world." "I knit them myself," Granny Ann muttered. "The children have to wear them," Granny Lee went on, "and you should see them. I always take them out to tea and watch their faces as they walk out in their horrible, huge, brightly coloured jumpers." "I've got a much better idea," Granny Adams interjected. "My grandchildren are a little overweight, so guess what I buy them? Chocolates. I get them a whole box, and of course they eat them, and that just makes them fatter and spottier, and when they go back to school they're terribly teased, and all thanks to me. You should try the chocolate wheeze. The little brats can never resist a chocolate." "It seems to me that you should combine the 2 ideas," Granny said. "Give them the chocolates and give them a jersey that's a little too small. Then, when their tummies are bulging, it will really show." The other 4 grannies thought about this and then all shrieked with laughter. More glasses of whisky were poured, more beer cans were cracked open. The fat granny was laughing so much that her whole body was convulsing and her face had gone bright red. Joe couldn't bear any more. He took 3 steps away from the door, shrinking into the shadows of the hall. But even as he went, he heard his name once again being bounced round the card table. "So you're going to take the boy?" "Oh yes, he's coming. I've had my eye on him for a long time."